All right, so now we're talking about Susan Glaspell. Susan Glaspell, and the work that we read of hers this week is Trifles, a play that I just love. Um, anyway, if you look at the written out lecture, there is a photo of Susan Glaspell. She, if you notice from the photo of Susan Glaspell compared to the one of Amy Lowell, there's a big difference in not only dress, but also haircut. Remember we talked about the bob haircut, that kind of short bob becoming really popular with flappers and women of the 1920s. You definitely see that here. Susan Glaspell doesn't have that, long hair pulled up into a bun like Amy Lowell. She's also wearing what appears to be like a blazer, so kind of more like a businessy type look, and then a shirt underneath that instead of the, finery and puffery of what Amy Lowell was wearing. So you can already see that transition from that old regime to the new, post-war look that these women started having. There are also links in the written out lecture. I got a link to the Susan Glaspell Society, which is devoted to retaining, clarifying, and spurring interest in Susan Glaspell's work as an important 20th century Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, short story writer, biographer, and playwright. And then there are some links to there's a blog that's kind of interesting, which is from the Glaspell Society, and it charts where different recent and even current performances of plays like Trifles were written around the world or are being performed around the world. So that's kind of neat. And then there's an interesting website of the Provincetown Playhouse, which is the theater that Glaspell and her husband and friends formed, and that also first performed Trifles, the play we read. The website lists plays that were performed there, as well as information about the plays and their authors, including Trifles and Glaspell. Beginning with a monologue about Susan Glaspell's life delivered by a character representing Susan Glaspell herself. There's a YouTube clip. So that's fun to see a play come to life because right after the character who is representing Susan Glaspell addresses the audience, we launch into an on-stage version of Trifles, and it's a good one. It's well acted and it's accurate. It accurately performs the play, so that's really fun to check out. It's fun to watch a play because literally plays were written to be performed, right? Most people don't write a play just to be read; they write it to be performed, and so I kind of think you get more out of it when you both read and watch it, right? Definitely. All right, so check that out if you can. Then there's another YouTube link that features a 1980 short film version of Susan Glaspell's A Jury of Her Peers. So A Jury of Her Peers is the short story version of Trifles. So Susan Glaspell first wrote Trifles, the play, and then she thought, you know what? I could convert this play into a short story that people might want to read. So she did, and she called it A Jury of Her Peers. So it's the same story, but told in a different format. Anyway, you can watch a film version of that. It's a slightly different from the play version. Like it definitely starts off differently. And we see sometimes characters that don't appear in the play version, but it's kind of interesting to compare and contrast. And then there's another film version, actually Alfred Hitchcock. You know Alfred Hitchcock, right? The famous movie director who would direct all those suspense films, like Psycho and The Birds and The Rope and Rear Window and Vertigo. Yeah, that Alfred Hitchcock. Anyway, during the 1950s and into the 1960s, he actually produced a television series. And that television series is kind of like the Twilight Zone in a way, but like very like short, half hour or 20-minute little suspenseful stories, right? That sometimes might have something creepy going on or something to figure out or something to wow you in one way or another. Anyway, that television series was called Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and in 1961 it featured a liberal adaptation of Glaspell's short story A Jury of Her Peers. So you might want to check that out because that's kind of cool. It's the Alfred Hitchcock Presents version. Then there's a lecture on Susan Glaspell and her play, Trifles, which I'm giving you right now, but if you want like more in-depth discussion of symbols, right now we're doing an overview so that you have a good grounds for reading and understanding the play and making those connections yourself. And then there's another lecture, and then there's an IMDb page that lists different film versions of Susan Glaspell works. All right, so Susan Glaspell, an American, lived from 1876 till 1948, so to 72 years of age. So that's a fairly long life for that time period. She was born in Davenport, Iowa, to Elmer Glaspell, a feed dealer, and Alice Keating Glaspell, an Irish immigrant. She was a star student throughout school and gave the commencement address at her high school graduation. Kind of cool. Right after high school, she became a journalist. Despite being told college would make her quote unquote unfit for marriage, Susan later attended Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, where she majored in philosophy. Kind of an interesting major. And she excelled on the debate team there and even represented the debate team at the state competition her senior year. She graduated in 1899. Rebuffing a culture regarding journalism as a quote-unquote man's profession, Susan returned to it, because remember, she had been a journalist, then she decided to go to college. She graduated from college and then decided to go back to journalism again. And she worked at the Des Moines Daily News. She also wrote fiction on the side. After her short stories started appearing in Harper's and Ladies' Home Journal, and her novels were published, Susan moved to Greenwich Village in New York City. So, yeah, fun place, to live. After 2 years in New York, Susan married George Cram Cook, a native of her hometown and a Harvard graduate. And I'm sure Greenwich Village was a contrast to, growing up in Iowa quite a bit. And maybe that's why it appealed to them. But the two of them soon formed a theatrical group called the Provincetown Players, along with some friends, because they started off performing in Provincetown on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, where the couple spent their summers. So they lived in New York, but they spent their summers in Massachusetts. And one summer, they thought it would be fun to put on, like an evening of entertainment. And like a couple of them had plays that they had written, like Susan Glaspell had written something and a friend of theirs had written something, and they decided, let's just put this on for our friends. So they performed it in a house there. And I think they used like the background was like on the balcony. So it was like the landscape. And then the other one, they turned around and flipped it and use the house as the background, the interior. So that's how Provincetown Playhouse started off. It started off in a house in Provincetown on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And then it caught on, like these showings, like word got round and people wanted to see them. They didn't have like television shows and things like that, and movies were not talkies at the time. So, people decided, hey, this looks like a fun form of entertainment. And so their performances became more and more popular. And so they became a whole troupe. They formed a troupe and they later started performing in a makeshift theater in Greenwich Village, where the couple spent their winters. So Provincetown Players started off in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, but then moved to New York City. Susan and her husband, because that's where they live full time, Susan and her husband and some friends created the Players as a venue for their avant-garde one-act scripts. The Players started modestly, as I explained, but with such friends as Eugene O'Neill, really, really famous himself later on, and they had also Edna St. Vincent Millay. You remember we read Edna St. Vincent Millay, First Figs. Remember that poem of hers? John Reed. Oh, and also she wrote Apostrophe to Man and Childhood is the Kingdom Where Nobody Dies. So we read all three of those. John Reed and Michael Gold and Susan herself penning material. The Players soon became a critical and commercial success because they had such great people writing for them. But it was this confluence of great events because like these people weren't famous per se then, but they all started working together and they all ended up being, or many, not all of them, but many of them became great writers in their own right. Eugene O'Neill's plays alone won the Pulitzer Prize 4 times, and he also won a Nobel Prize in Literature as well for his plays. Susan's husband, George, however, became disillusioned by the success that the Players were enjoying, so he moved with Susan to Greece from 1922 till 1924 when he died. So after his death, Susan moved back to Provincetown. She married again, but later divorced, and she wrote there for the rest of her life in Provincetown. She wrote novels, plays, and short stories. Her 1930 play, Alison'S House, a fictional account of a female poet based on Emily Dickinson. Of course, we've all read Emily Dickinson in our class, so you know her poetry and you know what she lived her life like. So it's called Alison'S House. You can imagine it must be about the house where this reclusive poet stayed all the time, right? I've never seen it, but I'd love to. I'd love to read it or see it. Anyway, it won the 1931 Pulitzer Prize for Drama. And I believe it was also made into a movie. So it'd be fun to watch that. The work of Susan Glaspell that we read for class is, of course, Trifles, the play, the short one-act play, which she wrote in 1916. And she wrote it for her theater company, Provincetown Players, who performed it. They performed it, yeah. Susan based this play on the 1900 murder of John Hossack that she covered while she worked as a journalist for the Des Moines Daily News. Susan ended up writing 26 articles about the alleged murder of John Hossack by his wife, Margaret, who was arrested at John's funeral. Yeah. So I guess she was a suspect and they got her at the funeral. Now, Susan's first stories painted Margaret as a strong, cold-blooded killer who she argued was fully capable of, quote, having beaten her husband's brains out with an axe, unquote. That's Linda Benz V. And, quote, murder, she wrote. This is the article that Linda Benz V wrote that line in. It's called Murder, She Wrote. It's Genesis of Susan Glaspell's Trifles. Anyway, after visiting the crime scene and farmhouse where the Hossacks lived, much as the female characters' perspective of Mrs. Wright shifts in the play Trifles after they visit the farmhouse of Mr. and Mrs. Wright, Glaspell's articles started painting Margaret Hossack sympathetically. So her perspective on Mrs. Hossack changed after she went and visited the crime scene and the farmhouse where the Hossacks lived. As if seeing Margaret's world enabled Glaspell a window into Margaret's mind and heart and the home life that Margaret shared with perhaps an abusive John Hossack. It's very similar to what we're reading in Trifles and the women characters whose sympathies turn throughout the play towards Mrs. Wright herself, Minnie Foster, right? As she's also known. In an era when women often did not receive justice in courts of law, Glaspell tried to provide just representation in journalism and the court of public opinion. When Margaret Hossack was convicted of John Hossack's murder, Glaspell resigned from the newspaper and turned to literary writing exclusively. However, in 1903, Margaret Hossack was retried for the murder. When the jury could not unanimously reconvict her, Margaret was actually released from prison and returned home. Most of Susan's writings explore feminist issues, such as the life of the new woman in the early 20th century, as well as the effects of a confining environment and, quote, the impact of gender, unquote, on the way we communicate and interpret the world. Her first wave feminist play, Trifles, became an immediate success at a time when most women still had difficulty even publishing. Of course, Susan and her husband and friends had to start their own theater company to do it. Nevertheless, Trifles has become one of the most anthologized American plays of all time. So please enjoy reading more about Susan Glaspell's life and times and her play Trifles especially. I think you're going to like it. It's a whodunit and a very compelling one at that. And she embodies many themes that these women struggled with and dealt with during this time period. All right, enjoy.